I was better at home. Why don't you come on up? Because we're going to go live. Well, welcome back, folks. We did take our lunch break. One part that we had scheduled this morning was an update on body camera policies for correctional officers in the Department of Corrections. This was a proposal that was before the legislature this past session. And there was agreement that instead of going forward with it, we need to develop the policy first before we actually implement the program. So one of the requirements was that that policy would be reported to the Justice Oversight Committee. So we have Commissioner Baker with us. And then once we finish this conversation, we can then transition into the replacement of the women's facility and your trip to Maine, and then how that may have an impact on how we go forward with replacing the women's facility. We have the Commissioner of BGS here with the issue of designing the facility as well. So Commissioner Baker.
So for the record again, I'm Jim Baker, Interim Commissioner of Corrections. I'm not going to take much of the committee's time. I have a couple folks here that have been working on the policy, but I just wanted to level set. We've been working on the policy internally. They'll get you up to speed on where we are with that policy. We're at the stage internally where our legal counsel is looking at a draft, and now we're going to start inviting partners in that we had made the commitment to work with us. But I want to introduce Christine Coward, who is in our policy unit, and Jody Barrier, who is the project manager for the body camera project. You often hear about folks from the central office. These are folks from the central office doing the work. So I'm going to introduce them, have them come up. I'll let them make the presentation for you. And then if you have any questions of me, I'll step back in if that's fair enough.
Come on up. And before you start, if you both could just identify yourself for the record. Great. Welcome.
Hi, I'm Christine Cowart. I'm the Senior Policy and Implementation Analyst for the Department of Corrections.
I'm Jody Barrier, the Staff Safety Manager for the Department of Corrections.
And I would recommend, because we do have people on Zoom, that you bring that microphone close to you because it's really hard with the mask. And that does amplify it for the room as well. So that's great. So if you could just give us a quick update on where we are.
Sure. So Jody and I started working on creating a policy as early as June. And we started that by researching. We looked at other model policies that included what different police agencies were using and what a couple, I guess the Department of Maine's Department of Corrections was using. We looked at a bunch of model policies that were put out, including the ACLU of Massachusetts' model policy for municipalities and police. And then we started to pull out things that we thought best applied to our situation, because there's very few corrections organizations that use body cams at this stage. And the applications are very different than what you see on this in the community on the street. So we put together an initial draft, and that was based, as I said, primarily on model policies, including the one that the Vermont State Police use and the Maine Department of Corrections. I did also find input from 4 different correction agencies of different sizes, including a sheriff's office and one other state that the BJA had done a webinar on, and they looked at positive lessons learned and things that were difficult. And we pulled some information from there as well in terms of retention policies and when someone can view these recordings and things like that. So where we stand now is that we have a draft that we're combing through for legal issues. And that includes the standards for the body worn cameras and their use, including staff conduct, procedures for daily use, the standards for downloading, tagging, storage, review, and retention of recordings, the procedures for when they capture use of force resulting in death or serious bodily injury, and recordings relevant to criminal investigation and staff conduct. It also includes a section on training requirements and how they can be used in training and how staff will be trained to use the cameras. We are currently working with our legal department to comb through the plethora of legal issues that come with this, especially concerning retention and release. Who can view these, under what circumstances, and are there certain situations where we only want to record video or audio? What we want staff to download versus just record so that we know we're keeping it. All of these issues, it became very complicated very quickly. So once we get through that level, we plan to share it with our stakeholders, as the commissioner said. And we have a list of them, including VSCA, the ACLU, the Moss Group, Prisoners' Rights, Vermont Criminal Justice Council, Human Rights Commission, and individuals with a lived experience of incarceration so that we can gather input. From there, we hope to revise the draft one more time, send it for another legal review, and hopefully be on our way to finalizing.
And what, do you think this will be finalized by January or more like March, April, May?
A lot of that's going to depend, I think, on the cameras. So there are parts of the policy that can't be finalized until we know what camera we're using. And that's simply because of the way they work and what the direction we're giving staff. So they typically record all the time, and the downloading and the storage piece is handled differently on the different cameras. And we can't finalize those pieces until we know about which direction we're going with cameras.
And you can't go out and purchase the cameras until you have the policy in place. So I'm just thinking you would have a concept in terms of which camera you would like to purchase, and then you can finalize the rest of the policy according to the cameras that you would like to purchase.
So we've done some research into the cameras, and Jody can go into what that entails. Part of what we're up against is whether or not we're going to have to issue an RFP or not, if we are going to be able to do a sole source. We, I think, might have a camera that we'd like to proceed with. I don't have an official yes on that yet, but until even if we have a choice, if it has to go out to RFP, I don't know that we have a choice.
Joey, you want to weigh in on that?
Sure. Just the cameras, you would think that the cameras are just, it's simple and every camera is the same, but that is not the case. When I first started this, looking into them, that's what I assumed, but this has been a bear. Every camera is just completely different. So with writing up a policy, as far as keeping, like how long we want to be able to keep, retain these videos, we can't really say we want to keep them for 14 days if the camera that we get only allows us to keep it for 7 days. So that's kind of where we're running into the issues.
And Trevor, can you refresh my memory? We did appropriate the money in the bill, in your bill, but it cannot get expended until the policy is in place.
No, my understanding is
Or not?
they couldn't put the cameras into use until the policy was in place.
So they could purchase them.
There was no prohibition against that, that I recall.
And how much money did we put
$1
in?
million.
$1 million?
Yeah.
And what are you finding for $1 million? That you're looking for cameras, how many cameras you'd be able to purchase for that?
For $1 million, how many can we purchase? The pricing that we got was from one of the companies is for a 5-year contract and it's under $1 million and that's 300 cameras.
Is that what you were anticipating, around 300?
Yeah, so what we found out is, everyone's, so part of what our challenge is that the one camera that has been purchased by the state police is much more expensive than what Maine requires. So we've been in conversation with them to understand how we deploy them, what the policy looks like. But we gotta work that out. Yes. Like, Representative Scroll said, that's $1 million. It's governor's funding moving forward. We're thinking that we can cover 5 years. That's all got to be worked out. We're not going to jump on purchasing cameras until we get a little further on partners. First thing said, ties directly to that. So not going to be something clear. Even before we set the policy. We'll find what we're doing. That makes sense.
Teresa?
Sorry, I'm not as familiar with this. So will this be for in-facility use only? Those positions, like correctional officer positions?
Correct.
Probation of parole?
Yes, this policy as it's being written is only for within the facility. And I just want to follow up on something Commissioner Baker said, the 5 years of use includes the storage costs as well. So when we look at the package, we look at all the costs for the full 5 years when we're comparing different packages, because some require you to purchase, some are lease. So the only way to really compare them is over time.
So is this 5-year contract a lease? Is that what it is, more than a purchase?
It depends on which company you go with. So some you would be purchasing 300 cameras, and then if something happens with them, you have to pay for costs to get it repaired, or there might be a technical service piece to that contract. Some of them you're leasing, and if something happens to the cameras, they could be replaced.
Trevor?
Yeah, I'm looking at another report that's actually due tomorrow, which is the costs and training and things like that. Based on what I'm hearing here, you're probably not prepared to break that out or issue a separate report. Am I hearing that correctly?
Yes. So our understanding was that the report out in September. Final report.
Yeah,
I'm confused.
yeah, the policy that needs to be in place before cameras are implemented in the field is due in January. This is an update. But there was another provision in the budget, in the language. And I'll speak to it right here. Departments will identify the ongoing cost and funding source for the use of body worn cameras, including training, data storage, and redaction, and report those findings to Joint Fiscal and this committee on or before September 15th, 2021. So that's a different report.
Okay, so we were under the impression that this would cover both. So I can tell you that we looked at the different companies and over the year, the max would be $1 million. without knowing which camera we can go with, it makes it very hard to give an actual number. And I don't think we can do that without either getting sole source approval or going out for RFP, because we have to receive that.
Well, that's how I started my comment, but that's kind of what I'm hearing, that you really couldn't do this, what's being asked of you right now. So, yeah, okay. And if I may,
Mhm.
the $1 million, I'm also thinking what I heard, will clarify if I'm wrong. The $1 million that's been given to DOC, you're incorporating all these costs into that $1 million. So you're not identifying additional sources of funding to support those activities.
I think the one that you mentioned that just touched on in there is redactions, and my understanding is the companies, what's how to redact it, maybe we do that.
So Trevor, do you know when joint fiscal committee is going to be meeting? At all? Do you know when joint fiscal committee is going to be meeting? Because they also have to report to joint fiscal committee or
Well, I'd
joint-
say, yeah, they need to be.
so
So
do-
fiscal meeting on Friday.
this Friday, and you're
Yeah.
not on the agenda?
I think we have one scheduled for November.
Okay, so be a little more prepared in November.
We're still, we'll better than the same position. Not just because of complication, swinging the price of the company. We're not going to be in a position to say. that This is the company wrong. But Biden. We'll be
Okay.
able to say. We're going to say that $1 million is the whole package. of what we're trying to pull, not what we're
Any other questions here? I had one and it went away. Boom. Anything else? I'm sure this conversation is going to continue at some point. Now I know what I want to ask. So for the RFP versus sole source to get approval, where does that need to come from? To do a sole source over an RFP or vice versa? Where does that approval have to come from?
Where does it will come from? So if we decide that we want to go, the state has a contract. I think it's too early for us to talk about this, but the state has a contract with them. We're not really sure that the end is going to be. It's much more expensive. So we're more than likely going to submit request to the administration sole source.
Okay, I just wondered, is it done internally or is it a legislative approval that needs to?
We'll have to go to secretary.
Any other questions here before we move on? Okay, thank you. I appreciate, thank you for sitting in this morning too. So now let's transition to the visit to the Women's Reentry Facility in Maine. And we have Commissioner Baker, we have Commissioner Fitch, and also Bill Soul is zooming in. Bill is our Community Corrections District Manager. And I know that a few of you have taken a trip up to the Maine facility. I know some members, individual members of the legislature over the past few years have also toured this facility. There's also a facility in Concord, New Hampshire that's a little similar to the one in Maine. And I think to put it in context for the committee members, both the one in Maine as well as the one in New Hampshire, Concord, they have their facility, their incarcerated facility there on the property, but also they have a separate building on the same piece of property that is the reentry, where it houses the reentry program. And the advantage, from what I hear from folks who have toured this, is that when a person is incarcerated, in the incarcerated facilities, they can see the other facility, that then gives them some incentive to get there because it's a least restrictive environment. And once they enter the reentry program and move to that particular facility, they're very clear they don't want to go back to the other facility because they can also see that and say, no, I don't want to go back there. I've been there. So there's some advantages there. That's what I toured the one in Concord a couple, 3 years ago. I was hearing that pretty clearly from the residents there. I'm sure you folks, when you did Maine, you probably were hearing that as well. So just keep all of this in mind as we go forward and how we will be replacing, first off, our women's facility, but also we have some real issues within our other facilities that have the men. And you can't do one without the other. I think they're really connected for both male and female. We really need to look at our facilities and what we're providing for correctional services for both the male population and the female population. So with that, I'll turn it over to the two commissioners.
Well, thank you again. I think, Madam Chair, if it's okay with you, Bill Soul is here by video. Just for the record, I did not go to Maine. It was why I was on some leave over the summer when the trip was made. Commissioner Fitch did go with our correctional staff. And Bill Soul took a trip there on a separate trip. I thought maybe the best way to do this for the committee is let Bill and then Commissioner Fitch give their impression of what they saw. And then I'll talk a little bit about the thinking inside corrections right now, where we are, and you know, where I know the governor is in his thought processes about the direction to go in. But maybe if we start with the impression of the facility, Bill can talk about it from an operational standpoint. Commissioner Fitch can talk about it from her view as the commissioner of BGS and from her tour. And then I'll get into where we're thinking and where we'd like to have the conversation when we get back in January. So with that, I'm assuming Bill is there.
Yes. Yes, I am.
Okay, welcome, Bill.
Well,
Thank
I
you.
don't know if you know your camera's not on, but maybe you're not at a place where your camera can be on.
Oh, okay.
So while Bill is doing this, let me just bring the committee a little up to speed in terms of where we are for money. The capital bill put in $500,000, put in 500,000 for this FY22 to begin the process of looking how we go forward and replacing the Chittenden facility. With the goal that come January, we'd have some dollar amount, some options, how we can move forward with different dollar amounts in terms of construction costs. We wouldn't have any real designs, but we'd have some backup information. We also have put aside another 1 million in FY23 to go towards the beginning of design documents and site preparation, whatever that may be. It's not going to cover the cost. It's just we put money in there to start the process. So Bill, I'm going to turn it over to you. And if you could just identify yourself for the record.
Yes. My name is Bill Soul, and I am on an interim assignment as a project manager. And I apologize for not being on camera. Looks like I'm having some technical difficulties. But glad to be here and talk about my trip to Maine. I went up in July. I was very impressed with the Maine facility. They do a lot of great things up there. We've really developed a relationship over the past few months with the staff up at Maine. Today, we currently have 3 staff from the Chittenden Correctional Facility up there shadowing their peers and spending the day. And so we've got a number of staff go back and forth. So we're really doing some good things with them. I think it's really important, though. It's easy to get caught up in all the the reentry center. I mean, it's a great setup. It's really a nice thing, but it's really important that we understand the differences between the two systems, because the Vermont system is very different than Maine. It gives us some challenges that Maine does not have. If you look at our Chittenden Correctional Facility, we have a head count today of 103, and it's really a prison/jail facility. We have 45 detentioners, and we have a very transient population. And with that transient population, it really creates a lot of moving within the facility. We have intakes. A lot of those intakes are coming in with poor health, really unstable behavior, and they're coming in from all over across the state. I always said when I was running a facility that it's 20% of the population creates about 80% of our work. And that's really that transient population. They're really unpredictable, and we don't know them, and they're often coming in under some really difficult times in their lives. And it's not unusual for our detainees to end up resolving their cases, getting sentenced, and be required to be immediately released into the community within a short few days, which creates more scrambling. If you compare that to the Maine system, that doesn't happen. Maine has 178 detainee women today, but those women are all lodged at county lockups throughout the state of Maine. So because of that, the Maine prison system, the state system, is not dealing with those folks coming in withdrawing from drugs, all the initial issues that we deal with during that first 2 weeks of incarceration. That's all being dealt with in a county system. And then those folks will eventually get sentenced, and then they'll end up in the prison. In the prison in Maine, they're operating at 42% capacity today. So they have 144 beds, and their head count is 61. And with that 61, they have about 15 or 20 real long-term women prisoners that will probably die in jail, quite frankly, before they get released into the community. So they have about a third of their population is real long-term. And then below, as Allison mentioned, you have the reentry facility, which has 100 beds, and they're at 61 today, 51 today. So they're at 51% capacity. So what happens with their system, which is really nice, is before folks get into the reentry facility, they've been up at the main prison, they get a feel for what that's all about. They get a chance to really assess those women and make good decisions before moving them down to their reentry facility. Their reentry facility, what's really impressive is they operate, it's a 100-bed facility. I know the count's down today more than it usually is, but they operate with 21 staff. They have their correctional officers work 12-hour shifts. So they have 3 correctional officers that work the first 12 hours. And then the overnight shift is only 2 correctional officers. So there's not a lot of staffing for those folks. Maine talks about how women are eligible for the reentry facility when they have 5 years left on their sentence. That's not completely accurate. Because Maine doesn't have a parole system. They abolished parole in, I believe it was 1976. So what happens is people have a set sentence to be released, and you are released into furlough, or what they refer to as home confinement, when you're 18 months prior to completing your sentence. So to be eligible for the reentry program, you have to have 3.5 years left on your sentence. So you can go down there and then you're eligible to be released in 18 months. They have so their furlough program, the people at the reentry facility, there's a lot of great programs going on there, very positive. They try to keep it real. They do things like, preparing their own meals, their laundry, the gardening. It's really, they allow smoking, which some people say is unusual, but a lot of these folks are returning to the community. And if they're working in the community, they're allowed to smoke. So why do you butt heads over, you know, do you want to discipline people and return them up to the hill for smoking tobacco? So they do allow smoking there outside. I think the women appreciate it and they follow the rules really well there. So you're eligible to work in the community 6 months prior to being sent home on home confinement. Also, during that time, you're allowed what's called recreation passes, so you could go in the community and participate in what they consider social activities, such as going to a public park with your children, things of that nature. So it's a really nice setup. What I found interesting is they've been open for 4 years and they've had no escapes. And when I looked into that a little bit further, I think, you know, I think Allison was right with the facility up on the hill. That certainly is a deterrence. But the other piece is the laws in Maine around escape. If you're missing from a furlough status for more than 24 hours, you'll be charged with a felony escape, which carries up to 5 years, and you'll certainly be in a much higher security level. So there's a lot more hanging over your head than our current Vermont laws around absconding from furlough. So I think certainly that is a big deterrence. I think, you know, again, they handle a lot of things much differently around problems within the reentry facility. Drug use is not an automatic termination from the reentry facility. It's addressed internally through case planning and treatment. If you are using drugs in the community when you're working, you are removed from your work setting. But they try to keep it real, which is really nice. I think one of the advantages they have too is you have the women's prison on the hill. You also have the men's prison on the hill, and then you have the reentry facility down below. But it really gives, in terms of being cost effective, it really gives you an opportunity to share resources. For example, your administration, your business office, even their investigations unit. They can have an investigations unit that can work in both facilities. The PREA investigator that they have works in both facilities. And I think a lot of the local trainings that they do are done locally. So I think that's really nice. Again, the other thing I took from my trip to Maine is I just gathered a lot of information regarding gender-specific practices that I think is stuff that we can take back here to Vermont and utilize. Things like they have a separate use of force. You know, we have we have a use of force policy. Maine has a use of force policy for men and a use of force policy for women, which is very different. And just a lot of their language is much more gender specific. They don't have they have a strip search policy for the men. For the women, it's called a unclothing policy, but just simple things like that they've done. I think that's pretty much all I want to cover. I don't know if anybody has any questions before Commissioner Finch speaks.
So Bill, was there a lot of programming that was occurring within that reentry building itself for the women?
Yeah, it really is. I mean, that's the key to the success of the whole operation is keeping folks busy. And there's a lot of programming around vocational, educational, substance abuse treatment, you know, developing family supports. They have a whole menu of what I felt was really strong treatment with providers coming in from the community as well as staff. A lot of, you know, you think 21 is a very small number, but when you factor in you only have a handful of correctional officers, the program staff is working with a population with pretty small caseloads, which is really nice to see.
Dick, you have a question? You're muted, Dick.
I have a couple of comments and a question. First comment is, I hear over and over again comments like Bill's regarding our system, which doesn't have county jails, doesn't have local lockups, unlike New Hampshire and Maine. And I think it does bear looking at as we consider alternatives. We're not going back to a county jail system, obviously, and put it on the property tax there. But maybe as we're considering facilities, we should be considering a detention facility, purely for detention, rather than having particularly, we've noticed it obviously during COVID, but rather than having people coming and going so often from our facilities, perhaps that's what we should be thinking about. And that, of course, was part of the report, probably 15 years ago, recommended extension if you're going to build anything at the end of 10. I did want to mention, Bill mentioned absconding from furlough, and actually the change in the laws in Vermont came about as the former commissioner's recommendations to the judiciary committees, and we did go with his proposals. I don't know if you're suggesting that we revisit that or not, Bill. Before, it was concerned that people on furlough were getting charged with escape for being out of place.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just an observation. I think that, you're absolutely right. I mean, we currently have people on furlough now in the community, and they're not trying to escape. They're trying to avoid supervision. And I certainly don't think it's fair to charge them with a felony escape and add time onto the sentence. But I think as we go into the era of a reentry facility, I think we would need some specific language around how to address the folks that would leave a reentry facility, which I see is very different than leaving a home confinement type situation.
I appreciate that, because I think we do need, if we're going to look at changes there, I just don't want to leave anyone who's listening in to this with the impression that Vermont was weak on escapees. It was actually the department that came to us and asked us to change the law so that they had more flexibility.
And I think, Bill, what you're referring to is, you said 6 months prior to their home confinement date, that they could leave the facility for a period of time during a day, but they do come back to the facility, and the escape would be during that time frame. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about. I mean, one, it would be very easy to leave that facility. There is no fence, and that hasn't happened. And but I was, specifically referring to, you have 12, 15 women incarcerated there that are leaving every day, going out in the community and working at all different hours.
Mm-hmm. So if they didn't return to the facility at a set time that they were scheduled to, that's when they would be under what Maine considers escape. And then you have that 24-hour window where
That's
if they're
correct.
not apprehended, then it turns into a felony. So that's different than the system that we have here in Vermont when someone's on furlough or on parole.
Correct.
Sure.
I just wanted to clarify the amount of staff or the number of staff. Bill, you said that there were only 3 corrections officers on staff at night or during the day and 2 at night. Is that the entire staff for the reentry facility?
No, I mean, it is primarily on the nights. There would only be two correctional officers there, but there's a number of staff on site during what I consider normal operations hours, caseworkers and treatment providers and so forth.
And the programs that you referred to are with providers who come from outside of the facility?
That's correct.
So I think one important discussion on this is, what does the facility look like? And I'm going to ask Bill first, and then we can go into Commissioner Fitch, because there's some real issues in terms of the construction of a building, the amount of light, the hardness of the interior, the noise level. What did you see, Bill, when you visited this facility, the reentry piece?
Thought it was more of a college dorm style setup, very open, a lot of natural light. Again, there was no fence. If you drove by the facility, you wouldn't necessarily think it was a facility. You probably think it was a small school with, the gardens and so forth out front. A lot of open, no doors not that typical prison door, cells closing and stuff. It was, again, very much more like a community setting as opposed to a prison setting.
So why don't we switch to Commissioner Fitch? She's Chair of Buildings and General Services that really does the nuts and bolts of how a building's gonna look, basically. So it's all yours, Commissioner.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Hopefully you can hear me okay. This is the first time I'm testifying with a mask on. So for the record, my name is Jennifer Fitch and I'm the BGS Commissioner. I've been with BGS since 2017, and so I've been following this along ever since then. I did have the opportunity to go to the reentry facility in Maine along with DOC. And I have to say, right, we are creatures of routine and habit. So my staff already had concerns, right, because this is different, right, than a standard correctional facility. And so I went in kind of like, I don't know how I'm going to feel about this, right? Loved it. I loved the whole thing. So basically, as Bill said, there's no fence. So you park and you walk right in, and there's gardens out front, vegetable gardens, and the women are learning how to grow vegetables and how to harvest them. And then there's a kitchen facility where there's a cook that teaches them how to cook with what they're growing. I mean, I'm a gardener, and I love to cook, so it was fantastic. But you walk in, and as Bill said, it's very open. A lot of natural light comes into there. And really what I would label it as is hopeful. It's light and bright and hopeful. There were quotes painted on the walls, very inspirational quotes that you see as you walk throughout the facility. And then when you got to the main portion of the facility, really, I'm going to call it a spoken hub model just because it's easy to visualize it that way. But basically, your correctional officer is right in the center. And then you have 3 dorm type, what I would call living areas, 2 stories high in each of these kind of pods that go right off of the main center area. That was done intentionally in the design because they wanted the women to be able to easily access staff and services without having to go, very far. And so in doing that, they're making the staff very accessible to all of the incarcerated women that are there. And I was just blown away by the way the facility was laid out. And again, how light and bright and hopeful it was. The interactions between, I'm going to call them staff rather than correctional officers, because they are correctional officers, but it was a different type of dynamic just based on how the facility was laid out. And so really the women were very comfortable, right, approaching the correctional officers. And we spoke to many women that were there, and they loved the reentry facility and talked about how great it was to have this option for them and how much they were learning through the programming, all these life skills to help them be successful. And then I watched the interactions between, again, the staff and the inmates. And it's clear that they very much care about all the inmates that are there, or the incarcerated individuals, and that they want to see them be successful out in the community. And they're doing all they can. And as Bill alluded to, haven't had, according to what I learned when I was there, they have not had anyone escape. In fact, they've done really well in rehabilitating these women and putting them back out into the community. So it's a very successful model for Maine. In addition to the facility, right, we've talked about the programming and the life skill piece, which I think is important. And they have a good relationship with the community that they're in as well. In fact, so much so that the chef that's there that teaches the women how to cook is so well known in Maine that when the women have the opportunity to go out into the community, they're actually under demand. Like, people are asking, we want to have these women working in our restaurants because again, the program's working so well. So overall, I thought it was a fantastic model. It was again, really hopeful is the way that I would label it. And my staff, even my staff that's been around for 38 years, I'm sure Chair Emmons knows who I'm talking about, walked away with a really positive impression about how successful that model is and how they believe that model could also be successful here in Vermont. To the chair's point earlier, It's not cinder block construction, which is what we're used to here in Vermont as the way we've designed and built correctional facilities before. They're using sheetrock, and like Bill said, it's really more of a what you would expect in a dorm style facility. The only other thing that I'll add is we did have an opportunity to go to the medium security, that's how they label it there, prison that's up on the hill. And one of the things the officers told me there is that the surroundings and their environment makes such a difference on their ability to go out into the community and be rehabilitated. So for example, they said, we have automatic toilets that flush, right? You sit down, you get up from the toilet, it's got a sensor, it flushes for you, right? You would think this is such a small thing, but they said they have a really hard time just learning how to flush a toilet again. Because for so many years, you know, they've been held within the medium security prison, and that environment really impacts you, right? And how you're going to be able to go out into the community. So I think the reentry facility was fantastic in terms of their ability to create an environment that was supportive, and it was, you know, really rehabilitative to those incarcerated women. So I thought it was fantastic. I'm a fan. And so I definitely encourage people to go and see it if you have the opportunity.
If you look at those automatic toilets and think of the State House, I hope we don't compare. So would Bill or Commissioner Fitch, would this system also be as effective for the male population as well?
I won't be able to speak to that.
I'll let Bill take that one. Bill, why don't you answer that? Because we've actually talked about this internally. And what I want to kind of do is kind of put out there my conversation with the governor about this concept here in a few minutes.
Right. Bill, would you be willing to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I mean, my personal experiences, I certainly think it could be as effective, but there's certainly a big difference between our two populations. Our men's facility are essentially loaded with very violent offenders who have committed some pretty horrendous crimes, and transitioning them out into the community is very challenging. Where if you compare that to our women's population, we have, I looked at the population a little bit yesterday. I think we have 40 women that are currently incarcerated that are past their minimum, and they've all been in the community, but have had multiple infractions that have led to them returning to incarceration. On top of that, we have about 30 other women that have, my numbers are probably about 20 other women that are within 2 years of a release, and most of them are convicted of non-violent crimes. So I certainly think the success or likelihood of transitioning that population as opposed to the male population is, I like our chances with the women's population. That's not to say that we shouldn't pursue reentry opportunities for the men's population, but I think it's going to be much more challenging.
Yeah, right. Cheryl?
Thank you. Bill, do you have numbers on recidivism for the program?
Specifically to Maine, I do not.
Okay. Could you get those for us?
Yes, I'm sure I can.
Thank you.
Because the program's been up and running for
For
4 years.
Yeah, there's a 4-year history.
Yeah, that would be interesting to know.
So this leads then into the conversation, how do we go forward with replacing our facilities and our women's facility? Commissioner Baker.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. And I appreciate, just for the people that don't know, when he talks about his experience, he's a 40-year veteran at corrections. He's run facilities, he's supervised people in the community. He knows the organization inside and out. He understands the complexity of the individuals that we have supervised today compared to 25, 30 years ago. It is a different population. Let me go back to the women's, the concept of the women's facility for a minute. We have really rethought, since you left session, we've really rethought internally our thoughts around a new women's facility. I think we have an opportunity to engage in something that will be very impactful for women. Listen to what Bill said. Today, we have 40 women in the facility past their minimum. These aren't folks that we have to have in a high security area. This is another just point in time. I asked for some stacks about a week and a half ago. And I'll run down who was in the facility at the time. 32 detained. 18 of them were for listed crimes, but they're not convicted yet, going back to Senator Sears' point about the complexity of this dual system that we run. We had 9 federal detainees, which we have this relationship with the Marshal Service. We had 50 sentenced individuals at that time, and 31 of them were for listed crimes. But as Bill said, it isn't that level of violence that you see. Now, we do have some women in custody that have committed horrific crimes. On this given day, it was 6. So when you're talking about a population of 104, and the worst case scenario is you have maybe 6 violent individuals housed. Where we've come inside corrections, and this is a conversation I had with the governor, you really got to rethink if we should be spending $80 million for a secured facility. We have to rethink this. And there's going to be a lot more time to talk about this as we move forward. But to build a secured facility at, early on, the napkin dollar figure that, Madam Chair, you and I talked about is in the $80 million range. So we're talking about spending $80 million for maybe 15, 20 women. We really need to rethink the way we approach this. And from our standpoint, even though Bill's description of their system is different than ours, when you take a look at 40 women past their minimum, those would be 40 people that we would have in the reentry facility, not in a secured facility. We'd be working with them very closely on that skill development. And you're going to start hearing a conversation when you come back in the fall about us rethinking the entire way we're doing programming inside corrections. We're really moving towards a whole different thought process around what we've done inside corrections for, I shouldn't say programming, I should be saying skill development. I mean, I had a meeting with AOT 2 weeks ago. They need 45 snowplow drivers. We may not get our roads, I mean, I shouldn't be saying this but we may not get our roads plowed this winter. They'll 30 of our incarcerated population right now, get them CDL licenses and put them behind a snowplow. We got to rethink the way we're skill developing the individuals back into the community. What we're doing now is a model that's 15 or 20 years old. And I think what the staff learned by going to Maine was that Maine's ahead of us in the thought process. Listen to what they said. There hasn't been any in 4 years. I appreciate what Bill said about the statute. We can deal with that if that turns out to be an incentive. But I think the real issue is that what we're talking about is a major cultural shift in the way we deal with a population. The reason why the women in Maine, I believe, and I haven't been there, but getting briefed by staff and talking to Commissioner Fitch, you heard me talk about it. They're treated with a level of dignity and respect and put in an environment of ownership for the program that they don't want to screw up. They don't want to screw up the opportunity they've been given. What do we do here in Vermont? Send them up to a facility that is an embarrassment. And we have wire around the fence. We actually engaged through the Moss Group, a consultant. The commissioner met him, and he walked us through the facility on how to soften this Burlington facility. And I use this as an example, and I may have said this to the committee before, but I apologize. We have women, what happened was he's going through the facility and he sees that we had bunk beds taken apart. So there's 2 beds on the floor. And he asked, why did you do that? Well, because some of the women can't get up on the bunk without getting hurt. And so he said, why the hell would you have wire fence around the jail and have barbed wire on the top of the fence if they can't even climb on the second deck of a bunk bed? I mean, it's one of those duh moments. Duh. Yeah. So I'm really, when I briefed the governor, what I said to him is, being a fiduciary responsible for taxpayers' money, we really need to be thinking about before we send $80 million down the highway to build a facility, if that's where we want to be. So I think there's even more, Madam Chair, I hate to bring it up, but there's going to be even more conversation in your committee about the direction we're going to go in, because we really need to rethink this. Now, throughout the system, there's $30 million in delayed maintenance. The rest of the system is not in good shape. But what we're focused on right now in this conversation is the women's population. And I'm not sure, look, the HOK report is a great document for guidance around talking about we are the most expensive system in the country when it comes to staffing. Go back to what I heard the conversation this morning about staffing. Pay attention to what Bill said. They run the reentry. I mean, I almost fell out of my chair when I got briefed on this. They're running the reentry unit with 21 staff members. That's it. 3 during the day, 2 at night. The doors are simply locked. And for those 40 women that are in minimum custody today, past their minimum, they're just sitting there for a whole host of reasons. More than likely, some of it's furlough violations where they are interrupted. Some of it could be other complications on getting them placed in the community service. There's a whole host of reasons why they're maybe there, but they don't need to be in a security unit. And they need to be given the opportunity to demonstrate, if they're put into an environment like Maine has, that they can in fact show us that they can get themselves back on their feet with our support and move them forward to a more productive ability out in the community. So I know it's early in the conversation, but you know, I will tell you that the governor does support what I'm saying to you to start this conversation a little bit different. His concerns would be that if we build a women's reentry facility, we're adding another building to our portfolio. You know, we need to be thinking about that, right? But there's a big difference between 10 million and $80 million. Big difference. We would have to find out a place where we have to either retrofit or do something about a secured facility. We'd have to work out those bed numbers. We do in fact have women in our custody that have committed horrific crimes and are going to have a real hard time transitioning out of jail if that opportunity ever comes up. But the majority of the women that come through are traumatized, victims of violence, substance abuse, and the model we have now is not serving them the best way we can serve them. So I'm going to leave it at that and open it up to questions.
Thank you.
Did I miss anything?
I'm glad to see some movement on this because some of us have been working on this for a number of years, about 4 years, to replace the facility. So I'm really glad to see movement. I also would put out a word of caution that, yes, going forward and dealing and replacing with the women's facility, whatever model we choose, does not take the pressure off of looking at our male facilities and the real issues around not just the facility itself, but the providing of services to our male offenders. A lot of them have come in traumatized, substance abuse. It's a different reaction, but we can't forget that in the bigger picture. Just because we've taken care of one sector does not mean that we've taken care of the whole system.
I agree with you, Madam Chair. And as I said, I think you're going to hear us come into the next session with some conversations around, we've had the VCI program for a long time, made furniture, make license plates, make signs. We have a print shop. It's really the high school. It's time to rethink the way we're giving skill development to the bigger population, which is the men. So I think you're going to hear us come in with some conversation around that during the session.
There's some real systemic change that needs to
Absolutely.
occur in the whole system. And when you talk about a $30 million deferred maintenance, it's like your car gets to a point, you're putting $1,000, $2,000 into it every few months. So you're better off to trade than keep putting money into a car that's going down again. Questions? Ron? Sure.
I'm really glad to hear this conversation because as you know, Commissioner, I've had some interactions with inmates who are concerned about the programming, concerned about the facility, concerned about the staff. And you mentioned 80 million as opposed to 10 million. Is that a realistic number?
You know,
for
I'm using,
reentry?
yeah, look, I think this is just the chair and I talking at the end of the session with her committee about, you know, when you take a look at what HOK recommended for square footage, and we're talking women's facility now. I think the bed number, and I don't have the report here right in front of me, I got some notes on it, but I think it was 144 beds.
It was, yeah.
But remember, HOK was doing what we asked them to do based on us giving them population numbers and not really thinking about who's in those numbers and what's their classification in that number. So when I say 80, it's like the back of a napkin of what it would be to be thinking about a secured women's facility for 144 beds. The 10 million comes from the dollar figure that Maine spent to do their building in Maine.
But the big difference there, they did not have to purchase land. They had the infrastructure already there.
Correct.
So if you start from scratch, you're gonna have to purchase land. Then you're gonna have to figure out your infrastructure of getting water, sewer, electrical to the site. Where if you already own the land, that's already there. So that's the balancing act, even before you get into the actual construction of the building.
And again, we have, you know, some ideas that we bounced around, and I think we can, I'll let this set with all of you. Certainly, at some point, getting Senator Benning up to speed on what we're thinking because of Senate institutions. But I put it out there for you just to be thinking about where we are internally in our thought processes around dealing with the women's population. And I know it's being repetitive, but what Madam Chair says is 100% right. We still have the bigger issue about a system of buildings that drive the number of staff we need because of the way the buildings are set up. Not only that, it drives our medical cost. The way the buildings are set up, we got to have 6 medical facilities spread throughout a system that you've got to staff. It drives cost. And I mean, HOK's report was pretty clear on that. It drives our cost because of the way we're structured. So that's a bigger conversation, I think, after the women's conversation, where we are.
I think for construction costs, I forgot what the number is. Joe H is always putting out the number per, how much it costs per bed in a traditional correctional facility. I want to say 100,000, but I think it's a little high.
I can get back to the committee on that.
But if you're doing a reentry, you're in a softer environment. So it's not so much per bed.
That is correct. And in Maine, they told me that they had $10 million reserved for the project. And it actually came in less than what they were projecting. So they added basically to the footprint of the building. The other thing I'll let folks know, right, is that it's 4 years later. There is inflation, and right now the construction market is very volatile. So trying to do estimating right now is challenging, but certainly Commissioner Baker is 110% correct. It would be more cost effective than a traditional correctional facility here in Vermont. Absolutely.
Other questions, thoughts? So this is work in progress. And we purposely put money aside to start the ball work rolling. We'll have more information once January comes along, and we're going to keep continuing to go forward on replacing the women's facility.
You know, the last thing I'll add is that we do continue. We are starting conversations with some of the stakeholders. Bill's working on that. And I even suggested to Bill the other day that we grab one of our vans and take some of our stakeholders up to Maine to see. And, a shout out to Maine. They're being unbelievable kind to us. We have, like Bill said, we have staff up there today. And this is part of the cultural change of the mindset that we want around coming out of the MR report. And, this is the mind shift that we need to make inside corrections. We're talking about the women right now, but this is the mind shift that we have to make right now.
Thank you. Anything else? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jeez, we're actually a little ahead of schedule, believe it or not. Yeah, really. So the last item in terms of testimony we have is Karen Gannett, and I know she's zoomed in, and then Robin Joy with the Crime Research Group. We were wanting to look at a review of folks who have misdemeanors and are on probation, and how that is being used, and what is being looked at by the Sentencing Commission on this. So, Karen, are you ready to go with your testimony? I know that there's a document, there's paper copies there, and I'm assuming it's also on our committee page for that. So Karen, I'll turn it over to you. If you could just identify yourself.
Okay, I'm Karen Gannett. I'm the Executive Director of Crime Research Group, which is Vermont Statistical Analysis Center. And soon to join me, she may be waiting till 2:30 to get on, Dr. Robin Joy, who is our Director of Research, should be on shortly. Because we're going a little early, she may make it to the very end, but if you have questions about the data, she's your person. Peggy asked me to share my screen, so I'm going to do that, see if I can do that. I'm technologically challenged, there's no doubt about that. So let's see if I can do that. There we go. Can you all see that?
Well, we can see. Yes. Yep.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. So just as a little way of background, Act 24 directed the Sentencing Commission. I'm a member of the Sentencing Commission, and Robin and I both provide technical assistance to the commission. Act 24 directed the Sentencing Commission to review the probation statute and the December 3rd, 2020 report of the Pew Charitable Trust entitled States Can Shorten Probation and Protect Public Safety. And they asked the Sentencing Commission to consider whether Vermont should limit the duration of probation terms for misdemeanor offenses to 2 years. The Sentencing Commission met on July 30th to discuss the issue of shortening probation for misdemeanors. Dr. Robin Joy extracted the data for 5 years, from 2015 to 2019, for probation sentences that were longer than 2 years. She found that 18 dockets carried probation sentences longer than 2 years during that 5-year period. So between 2015 and 2019, there were 18 dockets. One docket equals one individual. In this case, there were actually 17 individuals. One person had 2 dockets, which mean they had 2 separate incidents that they were involved in. And these 18 dockets represented 23 charges. So for each docket, you can have more than one charge. And these were sentenced to more than the 2 years on the maximum for a probation sentence. We've given you the list of the final misdemeanor charges, how they were adjudicated. I'm not going to go through every one of them. So, normally charges get pled down for their sentencing. So this is what they ended up with. And what we found, and we didn't do a whole lot of detail on this because the numbers were so small. So I do want to say 2015 had the largest number. They had 50% of the dockets at 9. The other years had all less than 5. And we don't give information out on information less than 5 because it could identify a person. So I just wanted to give you that explanation as to why we didn't do these all individually. Range on the minimum sentence was 30 days to 9 years. The range on the maximum sentence was 2.5 years to 12 years. 14 out of the 18 dockets were sentenced to 5 years or more on the maximum. All defendants were white. No county sentenced more than 5 dockets or individuals to greater than 2 years. and no individuals in Essex, Orange, or Grand Isle counties were sentenced to greater than 2 years probation. And really, that's about all we had. The reason we did a little more detailed information is when we presented to the Sentencing Commission, and it showed how few there were questions about, well, can you find out by digging a little bit deeper, can you find any disparities in what we do have? And we didn't find that there were counties that were out of whack with other counties, and we didn't find that there were racial disparities. We didn't have information on gender, so we don't know how many male and how many female. But we wanted to give you a little more information than just the, this is the number for each year. And I'll pause there if you have any questions.
So I can't see Senator Lyons or Senator Sears or Representative Pratt. So I don't know if you have any questions. I can't see you up on the screen.
No questions from me at this time. Thank you,
Okay.
Madam Chair.
So
No,
don't
I
know-
have none.
I'm good as well. Thank you.
I'll just, oops, I'm sorry.
Do you have a question, Cheryl?
No.
Okay. So these 14 final misdemeanor charges, are the folks for these currently still on probation? Do you know?
Well, that I'm not sure about. I'm assuming that because some of them are up to 12 years, that it's entirely possible some are still on probation.
And particularly if they were, given the sentence of their sentence, but they're on probation in 2019, chances are.
Exactly. Yeah,
So-
it depends. Yeah, it depends on the date of the beginning of probation.
I don't see any questions. I think we just wanted to see what the numbers were, of how many dockets that they were, how it's playing out, and what really the crimes were.
I think this was a really important look at how many people were beyond the 2 years. Because in reading the Pew article, there were some states made some pretty significant changes in their probation laws based on the fact that so many people were beyond some kind of minimum range of probation. So I think doing this gives you information that you didn't have before, and I think it's really important for you to have this information. I can end by just saying that at the meeting the Sentencing Commission concluded that they don't recommend adopting any change to probation at this time, just based on these numbers, and that more detailed information will be in the report, which is being written now and will be reviewed within the next 2 weeks and then submitted to you all on October 1st.
Yeah, I mean, with 14, it just really doesn't, in the scheme of things, provide much. In fact, it shows we're doing pretty good as a state in that length of term for probation. Any other questions? Well, that was great, Karen. That was short.
That was easy. Thank you, everyone. It's nice to see you all.
Okay, take care and let Robin know that we're done with the testimony. Okay, that concludes our agenda items except for committee discussion. We do have our next meeting is October 12th, and then the meeting after that will be November 5th. That's what we know at this point. As we proceed into October, we can figure out our December meeting. I think it's a little too far out right now. We know our next meeting, we'll be working with the expungement issue. I'm open for discussion on what would be part of our work at our next meeting. I'm thinking of going to see what our charge is. And Jenny,
So,
one thing we talked about too was having the child protective, a joint meeting with them.
that probably November is a good time for that one. Representative Emmons, Madam Chair, will Michelle be able to bring back a piece of legislation for our review on the ceiling, expungement ceiling piece by next meeting?
That was the thinking. We have Michelle here. That was the thinking this morning, correct?
Yes, I mean, it's gonna be kind of an outline, it'll be the framework for it, so you're still gonna.
I don't know if she can hear you. Can you hear her, Jenny?
Yes, yep,
Okay.
very well.
Okay.
Yes, I will have the beginnings of a draft, there's still a lot of policy things for you to consider and make some choices on further, but I'll have the basic structure of the one tier system.
So that would take a good hour and a half discussion.
Oh.
Say,
I
when
think we're
you,
gonna need to hear from some witnesses,
okay,
you know, on the issues that we talked about around access. Have access,
right.
under what circumstances should they have access?
So that's going to really be the bulk of our meeting. That should be the morning session. And that would be the bulk of our morning. I would-
Have you all done the transport issue?
No, that's the one I was looking at too.
Okay, because that one, you're supposed to have some kind of recommendation by November, mid-November.
So that would,
Yeah, that's by November 15th. We would send the report to House and Senate approbes and gov ops and judiciary. So that's a complicated, that's a complicated issue.
Yeah, and do you know who has, on our staff, who has worked on that before? Don't know.
On our side, in terms of
I'm wondering
transport,
about within, because like, I'm just wondering if there's somebody in in my office. I was wondering, you know, like Becky handles
could be
the
Becky.
facility stuff. I just wasn't sure if there was somebody I can reach out to.
I'm
who
trying to
has-
think.
Because it's around mental health facility. I don't know.
we
It's not-
got into prisoner transports with the sheriffs.
Mhm.
We've been doing that, Dick. I think it was working. I don't remember
Sure.
when.
It was
Let's count.
joint fiscal and I'm gonna say it was joint. Stephanie Barrett worked with us on the sheriff language and I think it was Bryn.
You know, and I know in my committee in institutions, we looked at transports of offenders with the sheriff's system. I think it was Becky. It was quite a
I'm just
while
wondering if
ago.
it's because is it around contracting with the different? I'm
Well,
trying to-
there's a, no,
Yeah.
there's a report from the Auditor of Accounts on the use of state paid deputies during the pandemic that he just filed. So it would be appropriate to have him at the next meeting to go over that. And then we go from there.
So the auditor goes over his report.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting report because, you know, here these state paid deputies, they pretty much did whatever the sheriff told them to do, took time off or whatever. So it was not, you know, you got to go over the report itself. But there's also a lot of vacancies with state paid deputies right now. And when Steve Howard mentioned juveniles sitting in police stations, chained, etc., you know, that's a direct reflection on the lack of support, a lack of transport ability for juveniles. And Sheriff Mark Andrews down in Brattleboro just in a contract with DCF to provide, at least in the south, transport for juveniles. You know, it's a very, all these different agencies pay different rates. Mental health pays more, DCF pays more, and the courts pay less. And then you have courthouse security, which is another problem. So all these relationships with 14 different sheriffs.
So I'm just wondering how to structure this. Would it be worth it to have someone from state attorneys and sheriffs, John Campbell or some of his folks, to come in
Yeah,
and,
it'd also be helpful, might be helpful to, but the auditor's report, you know, it's interesting because, but we don't know what the future is for transports as we
Right.
have more and more remote hearings. So those are transports are basically, those transports are basically to court and back. And the idea from joint fiscal perspective, when they put that in the budget bill, was to have somebody look at the future of transports, justice oversight, and should we consider alternatives? For example, having one contract with the court rather than 14 of them.
Mhm.
You've got for security anyway, and then you have your transports, which
So I'm just wondering, so the committee members can understand the transport issue right now, you really need the sheriffs and state's attorneys to come in and lay the groundwork. Then you can go into the auditor's report. If we're looking at the current system for transporting prisoners and folks with mental conditions or psychiatric disabilities who are in the custody of the state, that's going to open up a large conversation, more so than the prison transport. That's where I'm kind of trying to figure out how to
the
navigate.
state paid deputies are basically for your court hearings. So they're bringing people to court and back and so forth. And the question that I ask, and I would support one or two contracts going out to bid with various sheriffs, rather than having all the sheriffs try to provide this transport. There should be a central dispatch of it.
So the issue is, as we move into this, to go from 14 separate contracts to possibly going into one contract, and what would
Or
it take?
two, one north, one south, something like that.
So if we did that in the afternoon,
I'll be here, but.
so we could do the state's attorneys, the sheriffs and state's attorneys, the auditor, and then JFO.
Yep.
I have a list here that
You get into DMH and DOC, you're really into the nuts and
Yeah.
bolts, do that. And DCF, I don't know either.
Well, I mean, you're also beginning to touch on some of the advocacy groups who may have an interest. So it can grow.
It can grow pretty quickly.
Yep,
Well,
And then legislators involved in this too.
yep.
but I think the basic issue that joint fiscal, or that the budget asked us to look at, is the state paid deputies.
The contracts,
The state paid deputies, there's 25 of them. There's, I believe, 5 openings right now that aren't filled. And there's a yearly cost to the state of those transport deputies, who are basically assigned to various sheriffs. There's, for example, the Chittenden County Sheriff has 6 of them. Does Chittenden County still need 6 deputy sheriffs just to do state transports? And then if it's determined they do, then
so that's where we need,
there's also a deputy, Ian may want to speak to some of the deputy sheriffs who do the transport, state paid deputies.
so we really need to understand the system as it is now. So that's John Campbell with sheriffs and state's attorneys to really understand the deputy sheriff piece. How
Well, I
many are-
think you also should hear from Judge Grierson or somebody from the courts. Because they're the ones that are doing in Brattleboro right now, they bring people back from Springfield who have no way to get out. Once the arraignment's done, they're basically on their own. They've been detained in Springfield. Now they're on their own. Many of them have no way to get transportation back to Brattleboro. So the
Right.
state paid deputies bringing them back to Brattleboro because it was a video arraignment.
So let's start with the state's attorneys. We can get an understanding of the sheriffs, the deputy sheriffs. We could go then into the auditor's report and joint fiscal, and then hear from Judge Grierson.
It's a large, complex issue, but if we focus just on the state paid deputies, the 25 positions, that would probably be a good start.
Yep.
That's what was complaints for. That the sheriffs were using the state paid deputies for other purposes.
Let's made a note of that. And Peggy, you've got that down too, right?
Is there a statute that, or what is the statute that provides guidance for what the sheriffs and deputy sheriffs do, what their role and obligation is within the county?
There is statute that's from the 1970s, I believe, when we closed the county jails.
Yeah.
That established the state paid deputy.
Yeah. Okay.
There's a question. I had a bill in relating to classified state employees because the sheriffs were using, the state was paying them, but they were under the jurisdiction of the sheriffs. And there was a question of pay, I guess, and also of working conditions. So I think this gets really complicated.
It is, because the sheriffs are elected. Some of them, they get some reimbursement from the state. Then they're also on the county level where they have to raise revenues to support their office, support their equipment, support their vehicles. So it's a mishmash.
These are 25 positions are state paid deputies.
Okay, so that's what we'll focus on, are the state paid deputies.
I think that would be helpful. And the question is, should we have 25 of them? Should we have them assigned to the sheriffs, or should we assign them to the state's attorneys and sheriff's office? How should they be done? And then Senator Hooker just brought up another issue, and that's should they be members of the State Employees Association if they wanted to be, similar to what they did with the victims advocates and I think deputy state attorneys and other groups.
So
Oh, it gets very complicated.
it does. We already did that. So I think that fills our October meeting pretty well. If we get into expungement and then the deputy sheriffs. That fills up our October meeting really, really well. And then why don't we leave it at that? Because it does meet our obligation in terms of what we need to do as a Justice Oversight Committee prior to November. Then we have some requirements for December. And Ginny, can you figure out when the Child Protective Oversight Committee's meeting and kind of how can we work? Who's your staff person?
Oh, that's a terrific person by the name of Peggy Delaney.
Okay, so Peggy, maybe she could help us figure out.
We have for child protection, we have October 29th. And then November 19th. Oh, October 1st. Oh, sorry. Yeah, October 1st, the 29th, and then the 19th.
So it sounds like we could do, Peggy, you said October 29th.
Yes.
Yeah, so Alice, I think it's probably either October 29th or November meeting. The presentation by the researchers will not take an entire day, so somehow we can sort out how this committee can come into the Child Protection Committee, or we can go into your committee meeting, and have a joint meeting for part of the time. Just
So we-
thinking,
Something like on the 29th, this committee here would be scheduled to zoom in on the Child Protective Committee.
we'll try to sort that out. And we do have some heavy lifting on a couple of topics coming up, but Peggy and I and others will try to work that out so we could do that.
And our next meeting in November for Oversight is November 5th.
So maybe
So-
that works, so let's just hold it and keep both those days as possibilities right now.
I'll just send an email out to the committees to let them know.
Okay.
Keep those dates open.
Sarah, what is it? What's the topic?
It's a UVM study. Is that correct, Jenny?
Yes, it's a foster child study and analysis of needs in the state. And they're supposed to be finished with it and have it wrapped up with a final presentation October or November. So we'll have to coordinate with them as well to make sure that they have their final report completed.
So we'll figure that one out. Jenny, you can work with Peggy. Peggy, you can work with me. We'll
Yep.
figure it all out. Anything else before we finish? We did good.